Hello, this is Sue Lloyd, Vice Chair of the ISSB, and I'm here with our Chair, Emmanuel Faber. So we're going to talk about our January board week here in Frankfurt, and it's the first board meeting of 2025. So I'll start by ringing the bell, as we always do. And today we're going to be discussing our latest educational materials that we've been working on to support the implementation of the ISSB Standards. Talk a bit about this week's meeting here in Frankfurt. But before we get into the board week, Emmanuel, last week you were in Davos, so maybe you could start by updating us on what you saw there.
Sure, thank you, Sue, and everyone. Welcome to the ISSB Monthly Dog and Pony Show, the first of 2025. Davos was certainly a very interesting place and moment this year. A lot of external events that were reflected in the conversations, both on political aspects, but also the climate physical risks that were all over the place in conversations. We really were focused on updating our audiences, corporates, asset managers, many others, about the progress of the adoption of the standards. I think the level of conversation that we had around the nearly 60% of global GDP coverage by the 30 or 35 actually now jurisdictions that have decided to adopt or use the ISSB standards resonated a lot about trade and competitiveness, and we had a lot of conversations about how S1 and S2 are providing actually tools to find out, to manage and to report ultimately for corporate advantage in capital allocation and cost of capital about risks that are very pervasive. Very interesting also to see the contribution of science on particularly tipping points on nature topics. Water topics were all over the place as well. So I could really feel in the audience and in the conversations how much and again there had been substantive progress made since a year ago at Davos, where I was sharing with Gillian Ted of the FT that we may be approaching a tipping point. I didn't know whether that was the one of the fragmentation of the system or on the contrary of the establishment of a real global and comparable language for these critical topics for the future-proofing of economics. And I think we are probably not there yet, but it was a moment to take stock and realize that we are probably approaching that moment of the correlation of factors around our work. So a lot of momentum, a lot of conversations. We're much more back to earth type of conversations, but I think the right ones. So that's how I started the year, but maybe Sue, you can tell us more, but I think you started the year in Hong Kong.
That's right, different part of the world. So I was really fortunate to be in Hong Kong early in January, speaking at the Asian Financial Forum there, which was a fabulous conference. And also it was a really opportune moment really to be in Hong Kong, given that very recently they published their final versions of their new sustainability standards, which are fully aligned with our IFRS S1 and S2 standards, and also that they published their roadmap towards the introduction of sustainability reporting as a result of the work of their cross-agency steering group. And so it's, right at the cusp of the beginning of this reporting in line with our standards there in Hong Kong. So really a great moment to be there. So I met with the Securities and Futures Commission and other members of that cross-agency steering group, and in fact participated in the stakeholder roundtable where I was able to hear different perspectives and exchange views, which was wonderful. And it was really great to see how in Hong Kong they're really focusing on the sustainability reporting, all aspects of it, capacity building, the digital reporting, the assurance, but also really clearly seeing a vision for how this reporting really supports capital investment, sustainable development, and also the pivotal role that Hong Kong plays in the region, being so close and part of China and also being so central within Asia more generally. And I think you can really see the value of the ISSB's standards as an anchor there in that region. And I really felt, an reality of what's ahead. It's a lot of work to do, but also I think excitement around the benefits that it brings. So quite energizing, I think, for me to start my year there in Hong Kong. So that's our travel. Let's now talk a little bit about the day job back at the ranch. And of course, we talk a lot at the ISSB, and I'll talk a lot today in our webcast about what we're doing to really help people who are starting to report using our standards. And so the next thing I think it's good to highlight is some materials that we've made available so that people can look out for them. So just recently, we have made available a webcast and a short fact sheet about the proportionality mechanisms that we have included in our standards. We put those proportionality mechanisms into the standards in response to feedback we got on our proposals. So in finalising the standards, we included these mechanisms to really make sure that our standards can be applied by companies with different levels of capabilities and skills and levels of resourcing, and also with different levels of preparedness for sustainability reporting. Some people have done quite a bit in the past, others haven't. And so these mechanisms are included to really make sure that these standards are accessible to all. And the particular mechanisms we talk about in the webcast and the materials are these requirements we include in the standards in a number of important places to say that you must use reasonable and supportable information, but to use that information which is available to the company at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. And that will depend clearly on your circumstances. Also that in a couple of places in our standards to assist companies in preparing information about anticipated financial effects and doing scenario analysis, for example, that the way that you use the standards or the disclosures you provide depend on your skills. And so we say, do what's possible given your skills, capabilities and resources. So again, designed to be fit for purpose for a particular company. So have a look at the webcast. It talks in more detail about those mechanisms and also gives some examples of how a company might use them to apply some of the specific requirements in the standards. So that's on our website now. The other thing that we've just finished, which is another important educational document, is what we call the Climate First Guide. What does that mean? Those of you familiar with our standards will know that in S1, we include a mechanism to say that companies can report on climate in isolation when they first start using our standards, but they have to do so using the General Requirements Standard S1 and the S2 climate requirements. And there's an instruction in S1. It says you can report on climate only, but you need to use the relevant paragraphs of S1 when you do that. This guide basically says these are the relevant paragraphs and this is how they apply to climate. So I'm hoping that will really help people understand in more, specific terms what that instruction means, how to think about S1 when you report only on climate in order to meet those requirements in the ISSB standards. So this is just an example. We're out and about talking to people, and these are the sorts of questions we get, and this is an example of how we respond. So Emmanuel, we are working away behind the scenes planning another important set of educational materials coming up in relation to transition plan disclosures. So maybe you could tell us what we're planning there.
Sure, indeed we are too. Thank you. And I'd like to just, as we start the year here, and hear you recapping on these important topics you just covered, to just say a big thank to you and the technical team for taking care of our stakeholders and all the preparers around the world that, for some are already in the process of preparing ISSB reports, like in Turkey, for instance, or others that are using this for their CSRD in Europe, and so many others. And the proportionality mechanisms and the transitional reliefs, I think that we have introduced, and you highlighted two of them here, I think have been absolutely fundamental in the reason why regulators, literally around the globe, of both very sophisticated markets, you mentioned Hong Kong, but a lot of emerging and developing economies as well have been decided to adopt the standard. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that we continue to issue those. In a way, what I'm going to talk about now for a minute, as you invited me to, is about transition plans, is also part of this, which is basically creating an equipment for an infrastructure for the constant and increasing dialogue between corporates, real economy, and finance and financial institutions on transition plans and transition planning. IFRS 2 requires that companies should disclose transition plans if they have one. And we have hosted in June last year at the IFRS Foundation the work of the Transition Plan Task Force, the TPT, developed in the UK as when it comes to disclosure materials, responding to a significant demand from a number of multilateral and international institutions, but also market demand to ensure that there is one set of language to express what is a credible transition plan, out of which decisions can be made at portfolio level and others. So we committed to, and we are now engaged in developing an educational material document that will be a proper ISSB document to support the application of transition plan materials, disclosures, that aims to tailor those materials to ensure their global applicability and deliver full compatibility with the global baseline and our particular IFRS 2 on which they will be plugged in a way. And by the way, we've just issued, because we want to really make sure we build that with very relevant stakeholders, issued a request for interest from stakeholders for them to participate in an event that will be in a couple of months' time to, again, inform our work and go further with more information available on this in our website. Which may bring us now, Sue, to more concretely our board week this week. Would you tell us a bit about what we have done? In particular, we voted to open for consultations on amendment to IFRS 2. It's a big moment for us. First time we amend standards.
Oh, exactly. Just to say that on the transition planning, even quicker than you might expect.
Well, you know how slow I am overall, so I'm sure we'll do better.
Weeks time.
Oh, weeks time. Sorry, guys.
Roundtable event.
All right, so stay tuned, not more weeks time.
Get sending in your applications quick.
Thank you.
But yes, coming back to us responding to feedback on our climate standard and acting, we've always said that we stood ready to support people using our standards and that we would be listening to stakeholder feedback. And our number one priority is supporting the implementation of S1 and S2. And I think our board meeting this week was the concrete evidence of that. So we decided this week to propose some targeted amendments to our climate standard S2 in the areas of greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. So as many of you will know, because you know the work of the IFRS Foundation well, we can't make any changes to our standards unless we ask you all what you think about it. So the next step for us now will be to propose what these amendments would look like, ask you for your thoughts. So we'll issue an exposure draft in the next months, setting out these proposals for comment. But what are we looking at? So we have been listening to people who are in the process of working on applying S2, and they've told us there's a few areas in S2 that are harder to apply than we had anticipated when we wrote the standard, and a couple of areas where we could have been clearer in the words. And so we're taking the opportunity to make amendments to address these issues. And actually, this is also a really good illustration of how we're working in partnership with our TIG, our Transition Implementation Group. Most of these issues were actually raised and discussed by the Transition Implementation Group, and their advice was, please, board, take a look and see if you should take further action. And so we're doing exactly that. So the first is a proposed amendment to make it clear that disclosures are not required about some Scope 3 Category 15 greenhouse gas emissions metrics in particular those associated with derivatives and some facilitated emissions and those associated with insurance activities. We've also going to propose a couple of changes to address the jurisdictional relief that we already have in S2. S2 already says that if you're required by a jurisdictional authority or a stock exchange on which you're listed to use a measurement method other than the greenhouse gas protocol, you can use that alternative method. We're building on that to make it clear that relief applies if only part of the entity is subject to such a jurisdictional requirement, and also to make it to expand that relief to say that if your jurisdiction requires you to use a different global warming potential value than that's required by S2, you can use that different value when you meet the requirements in S2. So designed to provide more relief for companies. And then the last one we talked about was a requirement that we have in S2 about disaggregated information for financed emissions, where we require industry disaggregation. At the moment, we require the use of the GICS, Global Industry Classification Standard, to do that disaggregation. We've had some feedback about that perhaps being slightly less widely used than we had anticipated, and so we're proposing some amendments to reduce the circumstances when you'd have to use GICS, allowing some different industry classifications to be used if particular circumstances are met. So all designed to help to provide relief, to really make sure that this is a proportionate ask of companies while still ensuring we provide useful information for investors. So really still trying to make sure we have that balance right. So if that sounds interesting to you, hope it does, keep your eyes out for the exposure draft, and we look forward to your comment letter. Now, Emmanuel, the next item that we discussed on our board meeting agenda, I feel like you're the man to talk about that, our project on biodiversity, ecosystems and ecosystem services, the research project. Do you want to tell us what we talked about there?
Yeah, sure. And that was interesting to jump from a super technical, detailed part of our standards to this very broad research that we have started, and that our staff is gradually narrowing towards the next stages of what will come after that research, and entering into a second phase of research now, as this paper was, I think, essentially summarizing the learnings from information needs of investors and how current disclosure practices are meeting or not their needs. I think it was really interesting to the conversation, I would say, more than anything else, because it was really about asking comments and suggestions by the board for the further research. Was this notion that a lot of the biodiversity and ecosystemic services issues, topics, risks, opportunities are local, if not all, so GPS located, which might warrant a different approach or an adjustment of our approach on how we are looking at things, as we did on greenhouse gas emissions, which tend to be much more global, even though we have very, I think, interesting and practical good reason why we also, for instance, look at disaggregating Scope 3 emissions to understand the transition risks that are much more local than one could think. So that was one. I thought it was also interesting to see that a number of industries were citing more than others, cited as being prone to have risks and opportunities related to bees. The notion that probably it looks like water has a slightly different parameter in the way data availability, homogeneity of the data and the disclosures practice is probably more established than in other areas. And none of that was conclusive in any way, but I think it was a really interesting stock take. And again, thanks to all the team that's been engaging, but also all the investors that we've been talking to and our teams. We understand how much that means, but we also are clear that the more we are listening and consulting with our investors, and actually I would even say, of course, with preparers in many ways as well, the more what we will come up with at the end of this research phase will meet the market needs. Interestingly as well, we had a bit of a discovery for us, and certainly for me, of all the work that's connected to the work of the IASB, our sister board, and in their approach to a number of aspects, agriculture, others, natural resources. And I think it helped us capture areas of future connectivity opportunities in the way these topics are already reflected or maybe reflected in the IFRS financial statements. So that was really eye-opening in many ways, and we really look forward to further update and stay with us because there will be
more to come. So I think that brings us to the end of our discussion about this month. So next month we'll be in Montreal in February, so it should be the sort of weather that you like, I think, Emmanuel.
Absolutely. I'll bring my ski maybe.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you. See you in Montreal.
For the latest developments from either the International Sustainability Standards Board or the International Accounting Standards Board, make sure to subscribe on the IFRS Foundation website, www.ifrs.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please take some time to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast player.